And now let's continue with the renminbi internationalization and China's economic transformation. And in this element here, we are going to look at the evolution of the Chinese currency policy. When we see a diagram like this, the Chinese exporters sell goods and in return they get US dollar. For most countries, the government don't get involved because whatever the exporter would do with the dollar they receive is their business. However, in the history of the Chinese currency policy, there was a time when there is something called surrender of the US dollar policy, meaning that the Chinese exporters have to then sell the dollars that they receive to SAFE. SAFE is the State Administration for Foreign Exchange, and it is part of the central bank. It is part of the People's Bank of China. And SAFE would then pay the Chinese exporter the market rate for renminbi. So one can appreciate how every day when these Chinese exporters are selling goods and they are receiving dollars, and the dollars is then passed on to the central bank, the dollar reserve in the central bank continue to rise. And this keep on rising until it was almost $4 trillion. Let me digress a little bit and talk about QE. What is QE? QE is when central bank buy bonds or asset and adding reserve to the banking system. What's the problem with QE? Well, it depends on where the reserves end up. Because if the Federal Reserve were to buy bonds and they pump in reserve to the system, money supply increase, where would the money go to? If the money goes into building new factories, create jobs, that's good. If money goes to speculative activities, stock market, asset inflation, that's not good, right? So when we look at some of the central bank's balance sheet, we can see since the great financial crisis, various central banks have increased their balance sheet, specifically the Fed and the BOJ. And when the Fed and BOJ expand their balance sheet, they did this by buying their own bonds. They buy their own government bonds and then they expand their money supply. One would argue that in the case of China, the People's Bank of China, they are also involved in a similar form of QE. But in this case, instead of buying their own bonds, the People's Bank of China have been buying US dollar. When they buy US dollar, it increased the asset size, the asset side of their balance sheet. On the liability side, they are pumping in more renminbi in the system. So if one were to ask whether this increase in asset for the People's Bank of China, is that an asset or a liability? The answer is both. Right? On the asset side, the People's Bank of China is seeing more US dollar because they buy the US dollar from the Chinese exporters. On the liability side, they are paying renminbi to these Chinese exporters. So what we have seen is that as this continue, the Chinese M1 rose significantly, and the M2, which include M1 plus short-term time deposit in banks, right, quickly rose to 128 trillion renminbi. Where has all this money gone to? Well, this money has flown into corporation, household, and this has led on to banks lending money. Nothing wrong with this, except that most of these bank loans have gone to state-owned enterprises, which are less profitable compared to the private enterprises. And in terms of asset, a lot of this increased money supply loans have gone into the real estate market, which is a form of asset inflation. Notice how the real estate market has been rising steadily all these years. So much so that it is not surprising to see a chart like this. By the time we get close to 2020, household with more than one property is now about 70%. So 7 out of 10 Chinese households own more than one property. Is this sustainable? Should one expect home prices to keep going up? What happens if they start to burst? Will it hurt this group in a dramatic way? Well, clearly, surrendering the US dollar policy cannot be continued. So the People's Bank of China tried different methods to slow down this increase in renminbi in the system. And one of the methods they tried was to issue renminbi bond. So the People's Bank of China issue renminbi bond, and this allowed them to mop the renminbi back to the central bank. The trouble is that on this side here, where the People's Bank of China, through SAFE, bring in the US dollar, and this is invested in US Treasury, yielding 2.4%. But when the People's Bank of China issue the Chinese bond, it costs them 3.6%. So here they are paying 1.2% for this purpose. Clearly, this is also not sustainable. The next thing they did was to allow locals to diversify abroad, allowing Chinese citizens to buy maximum $50,000 a year, so that when Chinese citizens buy US dollar from the central bank, they pay with renminbi. And the People's Bank of China is able to mop the renminbi from the system. Now, I use mop because it's just like your household mop. Right? It is used to mop up the liquidity from the system. Anyway, back to this here. So when I look at this, right, I agree with many commentators that say that when you allow the locals to diversify abroad, aren't these the same people who sold you the dollars in the first place? Well, to the extent that this is true, then this and this cross each other out, and they're just creating work. So the question then is, why not abandon this, right? Why not just let the people who receive US dollar from the exports, keep the US dollar and do whatever they want, right? Central bank do not get involved, just like central banks of most countries. For those who have an auditing mindset, one may question the mark-to-market process here. So, if over this time period, the People's Bank of China had bought $4 trillion US, $4 trillion US dollar at the average of 8.5 renminbi, that would translate into creating 34 trillion renminbi in the market. And if the renminbi were to strengthen to 6.25 renminbi to the dollar, then that would translate to $5.2 trillion. If China were to allow those holding renminbi to exchange renminbi for dollars, the mark-to-market loss would be $1.2 trillion. So, so a number like this doesn't make sense, right? Because the question then become political, right? Should the central bank be responsible for such a mark-to-market loss? This concludes this segment.